The soft hum of the city faded into the distance as Emma walked through the grand iron gates of the Wilkins estate. The towering mansion loomed before her, its sheer size a constant reminder of how different her life was from those who lived inside. She tightened her grip on the strap of her worn-out bag, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Emma had been working as a maid for the Wilkins family for nearly a year. The job paid little, but it was enough to keep her afloat. Every morning, she arrived at the mansion before sunrise, tending to the endless chores that came with working in a house so large. However, while most of her tasks felt like routine work, there was one duty she never minded: caring for Eleanor Wilkins, the elderly woman confined to a wheelchair. Eleanor was once a formidable figure in the city. Her wealth, influence, and sharp mind had built an empire. But age had taken its toll, and now she spent her days in a grand, yet lonely room, watching the world pass by through her window. Her family rarely visited, and the other house staff treated her like an obligation rather than a person. But Emma saw something different. A woman who had lived a life full of stories, a woman who, despite her riches, had been abandoned by those she had once loved. Unlike the others, Emma never ignored Eleanor. She took the time to speak with her, to listen, to share small moments of laughter. She would adjust her blanket when she shivered, bring her favorite tea when no one else remembered, and listen to her tales of a past life filled with adventure and heartbreak. One evening, as Emma gently placed a woolen shawl over Eleanor's frail shoulders, the old woman looked at her with an unreadable expression. "You're different," she murmured, her voice softer than usual. Emma smiled. "I just believe that everyone deserves to be treated with kindness." Little did she know, those simple words would change her life forever. Days passed, and Emma's bond with Eleanor Wilkins deepened. Unlike the other staff, who completed their tasks mechanically, Emma took time to ensure Eleanor felt seen and heard. One rainy afternoon, as Emma dusted the shelves in Eleanor's grand study, the old woman sighed, gazing out the window. "I used to love the rain," she murmured. Emma paused, curious. "Why is that, ma'am?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "When I was younger, my husband and I would sit by the fireplace, sipping tea, watching the raindrops race down glass. It was peaceful." Emma set down her duster. "You must miss those days." Eleanor's smile faded. "More than you know." She turned her sharp eyes to Emma. "Tell me, dear, do you have family?" Emma hesitated before nodding. "My mother passed when I was young. It was just me and my father for a long time, but he passed too." Eleanor studied her. "You must have been strong to survive on your own." Emma forced a small smile. "I had no other choice." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, Eleanor reached out, covering Emma's hand with her own. "You remind me of myself when I was young. Strong, determined, and kind." Emma felt a warmth spread through her chest. Few people had ever spoken to her with such sincerity. As days turned into weeks, Emma noticed a change in the mansion's atmosphere. Whispers among the staff grew louder. Tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. The reason became clear one evening when Eleanor's nephew, Charles Wilkins, arrived unannounced. Charles was a man of polished suits and expensive cologne, but beneath the charm, his greed was obvious. He rarely visited, but when he did, it was never out of love. Emma stood quietly in the corner of the parlor, pretending to dust as she listened. "Aunt Eleanor," Charles said smoothly, taking a seat across from her. "You look well." Eleanor arched a brow. "I'm old, Charles, not blind." "What do you want?" Charles chuckled. Straight to the point, as always. "Aunt, I was just thinking, it's been a while since we discussed your will." Emma stiffened. Eleanor's expression darkened. "My will is my business." Charles sighed dramatically. "Come now. You know I have the family's best interests at heart. You wouldn't want your wealth falling into the wrong hands, would you?" Eleanor's voice was ice. "The wrong hands? You mean anyone but you?" Charles's smile thinned. "You wound me, Aunt." He leaned closer, his tone lowering. "I just want to make sure everything is in place before time runs out." Emma's fingers curled into fists. Eleanor's grip tightened on her wheelchair. "Get out, Charles." For a moment, Charles's polished mask slipped, revealing frustration beneath. But then, just as quickly, he smirked. Of course, Aunt. I'll be back soon. Think about what I said. As he left, Emma turned to Eleanor. Are you all right? Eleanor exhaled. That boy. He's like a vulture, circling, waiting. Emma hesitated before asking. Are you worried about your wool? Eleanor looked at her, something unreadable in her gaze. Not anymore. Emma didn't understand then, but that conversation had set something in motion, something that would change both their lives forever. The following morning, Emma arrived at the mansion as usual, but something felt off. The air was unusually still, and the staff spoke in hushed tones, exchanging uneasy glances. As she made her way to Eleanor's room, she sensed the weight of something unspoken pressing against the walls. When she knocked softly and entered, she found Eleanor sitting by the window, her expression distant. A heavy envelope rested on her lap. Good morning, ma'am, Emma greeted, her voice gentle. Would you like your tea? Eleanor turned her gaze to her, eyes filled with something Emma couldn't quite decipher. Sadness, determination, and perhaps something more. Emma, she said softly, patting the chair beside her. Come sit with me. Emma set down her cleaning cloth and moved closer, heart pounding slightly at the seriousness in Eleanor's tone. After a moment of silence, Eleanor exhaled. I don't have much time left, my dear. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Ma'am, please don't say that. Eleanor smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I've lived a long life, Emma. I know when my time is near. She gestured to the envelope in her lap. This is for you. Emma hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned it over. It bore an official seal, Wilkins and Gray Law Firm. A lawyer's office? Emma frowned, looking back at Eleanor. Ma'am, what is this? Eleanor took her hand. You'll understand soon. Before Emma could press further, a voice interrupted them. Aunt Eleanor. Emma turned just as Charles stormed into the room, his expression tight with frustration. I heard you had a visitor yesterday, he said, barely glancing at Emma. Who was it? Eleanor sighed. My lawyer. Charles's jaw tensed. Why? Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Do I need your permission to handle my own affairs? Charles forced a chuckle, though his eyes gleamed with irritation. Of course not, Aunt. But you know how these things can be. You're not as strong as you used to be. It's easy to be taken advantage of. His gaze flickered briefly toward Emma. Emma felt a surge of anger, but kept silent. Eleanor's voice hardened. I know exactly who is taking advantage of whom. Charles's face darkened, but before he could argue, Eleanor dismissed him with a wave of her hand. You may leave now. Clenching his jaw, Charles turned sharply and walked out. Emma could hear his footsteps echo down the hall before fading. Eleanor sighed, leaning back in her chair. He's impatient. He thought he'd have everything by now. Emma frowned. Ma'am, what exactly is in this envelope? Eleanor simply squeezed her hand. You'll find out tomorrow. Emma left the mansion with a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. What had Eleanor done? And why had she involved Emma? The next morning, as Emma was preparing for work, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Hello. Good morning. Is this Miss Emma Carter? Yes, speaking. This is Thomas Gray from Wilkins and Gray Law Firm. You have been requested to attend a meeting at our office today regarding an urgent matter. Emma's heart pounded. What kind of matter? I believe it's best discussed in person, the man replied politely. Can you come in at noon? Emma hesitated, glancing at the envelope Eleanor had given her. She had not yet opened it, afraid of what it might contain. I'll be there, she said finally. As she hung up, her hands trembled. Something was happening, something bigger than she could understand, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. Emma arrived at Wilkins and Gray Law Firm with her heart hammering in her chest. The building was grand, its polished glass doors reflecting the bright afternoon sun. She had never stepped foot in such a place before, and as she pushed the doors open, she felt as though she was crossing into a world completely different from her own. A receptionist greeted her with a professional smile. Miss Emma Carter? Yes, Emma replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Mr. Gray will see you now. Please follow me. She was led down a long hallway lined with framed legal certificates. At the end of it, A heavy oak door was opened, revealing an elegant office where a distinguished-looking man in his 60s sat behind a massive desk. Thomas Gray rose and extended a hand. "Miss Carter, thank you for coming." Emma shook his hand, taking a seat. "What's this about?" Mr. Gray opened a leather-bound folder and slid a document across the desk. "I assume you were given an envelope from Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore." Emma nodded and placed it on the desk, still unopened. "You haven't looked inside?" he asked, raising a brow. Emma hesitated. "I was afraid of what I'd find." Mr. Gray gave a knowing nod before gesturing toward the document. "Then I'll tell you myself. Mrs. Whitmore made significant changes to her will before her passing." Emma's breath hitched. "Before her passing?" Mr. Gray's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter. Eleanor Whitmore passed away early this morning." Emma's world tilted. The room blurred, her mind struggling to grasp the words. "No, that can't be. I just saw her yesterday." "I understand this is difficult," Mr. Gray said gently. "She spoke very highly of you. She trusted you." Emma swallowed back the lump in her throat. What does this have to do with me?" Mr. Gray folded his hands. "Mrs. Whitmore has left you a significant portion of her estate." Silence. Emma blinked. "I what?" "She has bequeathed you her personal savings, a property in the countryside, and," he paused, watching Emma's stunned reaction, "a 50% stake in Whitmore Enterprises." Emma gasped. "That's impossible." Mr. Gray sighed. "I assure you, it's all legal and binding. Eleanor had been planning this for some time. She felt that you, more than anyone else, deserved it." Emma shook her head, gripping the arms of the chair. "But I was just her maid. Why would she give me any of this?" Mr. Gray leaned forward. "Eleanor was a woman of great wisdom. She saw beyond wealth and titles. She saw loyalty, kindness, and integrity, qualities that she believed you possessed more than her own family did." Emma felt dizzy. "And Charles? What did he get?" Mr. Gray's lips pressed into a thin line. "Charles was left a much smaller portion of the estate than he expected. He was displeased." A shiver ran down Emma's spine. "I can imagine." As if on cue, the door burst open. "You!" Emma turned just as Charles stormed into the room, fury blazing in his eyes. "This must be some mistake," he growled at Mr. Gray before turning his wrath on Emma. "What did you do to manipulate my aunt?" Emma stood, trembling but defiant. "I did nothing." Charles scoffed. "She was old, confused. And you took advantage of her kindness." Mr. Gray's voice was firm. "Mr. Whitmore, I must ask you to leave. This is a legal proceeding." Charles ignored him. He took a threatening step toward Emma. "You don't deserve a cent of that money. You're just a maid." Emma squared her shoulders. "Maybe I was just a maid, Charles. But at least I was someone she trusted. Can you say the same?" His face twisted with rage, but before he could respond, security entered and ushered him out. Mr. Gray sighed. "You should be careful, Miss Carter. Charles is not someone who accepts defeat easily." Emma nodded, still shaken. "I don't want any trouble." Mr. Gray studied her carefully. "Then the question is, what do you want, Miss Carter?" Emma took a deep breath, tried to process everything. She had gone from being a simple maid to inheriting a fortune overnight. But what did she really want? She wasn't sure yet, but she was about to find out. Emma left the lawyer's office in a daze, the weight of Eleanor's decision pressing down on her. The bustling streets of the city seemed distant, muffled by the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. Had Eleanor really meant for her to have all this? A part of her wanted to reject it, to return to the simple life she had known. But another part, a stronger part, knew that walking away wasn't an option. As she stepped onto the pavement, her phone buzzed. A call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Miss Carter," a cold, familiar voice sneered. "You've made a very big mistake." Emma froze. "Charles, you really think you can steal from my family and walk away?" His voice dripped with venom. "You're nothing but a thief." "I stole nothing," Emma said firmly. "Eleanor made her choice." Charles laughed bitterly. "That's what you keep telling yourself. But trust me, I will fight this. I will make sure you get nothing." The line went dead. Emma's hands trembled as she lowered the phone. She had expected Charles to be angry, but something about his voice sent a shiver down her spine. The next morning, Emma returned to Eleanor's house. No, her house now. The thought still felt surreal. As she stepped inside, memories flooded her. The scent of lavender still lingered in the air, and the quiet hum of the old grandfather clock echoed in the vast living room. She ran her fingers along the antique furniture, each piece holding a story. This wasn't just a house. It was a home filled with love, laughter, and kindness. A place Eleanor had cherished. And now, it was hers to protect. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Margaret, the longtime housekeeper, standing there with an uneasy expression. "Margaret," Emma greeted. "Please come in." Margaret hesitated before stepping inside. "Miss Carter, I need to warn you. Charles has been speaking to the staff. He's trying to turn them against you." Emma frowned. "Why?" "He's claiming that you tricked Mrs. Whitmore into changing her will, that you took advantage of her illness." Margaret's voice was laced with worry. "So believe him." Emma's stomach tightened. "That's not true. You know that." Margaret nodded. "I do, but not everyone does. And Charles, he won't stop until he destroys you." Emma inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She had spent years obeying, blending into the background, never making waves. But now, she was being forced into a fight she hadn't asked for, and she refused to back down. Later that evening, Emma met with Mr. Gray once more. She needed to understand what she was up against. "You should expect a legal battle," he warned. "Charles will try to contest the will." Emma clenched her fists. "Can he win?" Mr. Gray shook his head. "Eleanor's will is ironclad. She made sure of that. But that won't stop him from dragging you through court, tarnishing your name, and making your life miserable." Emma exhaled. "So what do I do?" "You stand your ground," Mr. Gray said firmly. "You don't let him intimidate you. This is your inheritance, Emma. Eleanor wanted you to have it." Emma nodded, determination setting in. She had spent her life being overlooked, underestimated. But not anymore. If Charles wanted a fight, she would give him one. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of shuffling papers and the occasional cough. Emma sat at the front, her hands clasped together, trying to steady her nerves. Across from her, Charles lounged in his chair, a smug expression on his face. His lawyer, an expensive-looking man in a tailored suit, was speaking confidently. "Your Honor, my client contends that Miss Carter manipulated Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore in her final days, coercing her into changing her will." Emma stiffened, but Mr. Gray remained calm beside her. "That is a serious accusation," the judge said, adjusting his glasses. "Do you have evidence?" Charles's lawyer smirked. "We have testimony from several staff members who claim Miss Carter grew unusually close to Mrs. Whitmore before her passing." Emma's heart pounded. Were people really saying that? She glanced over her shoulder and caught Margaret's reassuring nod from the audience. Mr. Gray stood. "Your Honor, we have evidence that Mrs. Whitmore had planned these changes months before her passing. She was of sound mind, and her legal documents prove that." He handed over a thick file. The judge flipped through the pages, nodding slowly. Charles clenched his jaw. She was old and confused. The judge gave him a sharp look. "Mr. Whitmore, unless you have actual evidence of coercion, I see no grounds to contest this will." Emma held her breath. Finally, after a long pause, the judge closed the folder and said, "The court upholds the will of Eleanor Whitmore. The inheritance remains with Miss Carter." Emma felt a rush of relief, so powerful she almost collapsed. Charles shot up from his chair. This isn't over, but it was. Security escorted him out as he ranted about injustice, his words lost in the hum of the courtroom. Days later, Emma stood in front of Eleanor's house, her house. The reality was finally sinking in. This was her fresh start. Margaret approached her with a warm smile. "What will you do now, Miss Carter?" Emma looked up at the grand house, then down at the legal papers in her hand. "I'm going to honor Eleanor's legacy," she said firmly. "She helped so many people, and I want to do the same." She had decided to turn the estate into a foundation, one that would support young women who, like her, had started with nothing. Eleanor had believed in her, and now Emma would make sure that belief lived on. As she walked into the house, the setting sun cast a golden glow over the walls. It was a new beginning, and for the first time in her life, she was ready for it.